Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. Jackson Reed thought he'd outsmarted the system. 2 perfect homes, 0 HOA strings attached. But when strange letters arrived demanding keys to his remote mountain cabin, a quiet software engineer found himself pulled into a shocking battle of power, control, and defiance. My name is Jackson Reed. I'm 38, a software engineer, and by all accounts, a pretty laid-back guy. I work remotely for a mid-sized tech company, which means I spend my weekdays in a cozy suburban home just outside the city, surrounded by neat little lawns, picket fences, and the constant low-level buzz of neighborhood gossip. I bought this house 5 years ago, specifically because it was on a street that technically bordered an HOA-managed neighborhood, but not inside it. I did my homework, believe me. I wanted none of their rules about mailbox heights, lawn decorations, or the color I could paint my front door. I valued my independence, and that house, legally outside HOA jurisdiction, gave me the peace of mind I craved. But what really made me happy, what really let me breathe, was the mountain cabin I bought 2 years ago. Tucked away high in the Rockies, that cabin was my sanctuary. The air up there is so clean, it feels like it scrubs your soul. Surrounded by pine trees with a wraparound porch overlooking a distant river, it's the kind of place that makes you forget emails, Slack notifications, and code merges. I'd go there on weekends or long holidays, sometimes alone to decompress, sometimes with friends and family to grill, laugh, and let the world shrink away. Best of all, it was in a completely different county, far away from any suburban nonsense, and definitely outside the reach of any homeowners association. I've always been careful when it comes to property. My job has trained me to be cautious, detail-oriented, always reading the fine print. So when I bought both properties, I made absolutely sure, triple-checked even, that there were no legal strings tying me to any HOA. The mountain property was private. The land had been privately owned for generations, and no one had ever tried to rope it into some sort of community agreement. That kind of independence was what I was paying for, and it was worth every dollar. Still, despite the peace of my mountain retreat, I couldn't entirely escape the watchful eyes of the HOA near my suburban home. They had always been, let's say, curious about me. At first, it was little things, flyers in the mailbox inviting me to optional neighborhood meetings, people hinting that I should participate more in the community, even though legally I wasn't their member. I'd politely decline, wave when I saw the HOA board president walking her dog past my driveway, and remind myself that as long as my name wasn't on their rolls, their little rulebook couldn't touch me. But something shifted recently. I'm not sure how they found out. Maybe idle neighborhood gossip, maybe someone snooping on social media, but they discovered I didn't just have my suburban home. They learned about my cabin, my beautiful, quiet, unreachable mountain cabin. And that's when the letters started arriving. Strange letters with strange demands, signed by the HOA president herself, a woman named Sharon Myers. At first, I thought it was some kind of mistake, a mix-up, a glitch in paperwork. Maybe they confused me with another Reed on the block. But as I read through those letters, my confusion turned to laughter, then to something colder, the realization that the HOA had set their sights on something far bigger than they were legally allowed to touch, and they weren't planning to stop. The first letter arrived on a Wednesday. I remember it clearly because it was tucked neatly among the usual junk mail, pizza coupons, a flyer for a lawn care service, and a reminder from my dentist, but the envelope stood out. It was formal, embossed with the HOA's logo, and addressed to me personally. I opened it without thinking, expecting maybe another invitation to a neighborhood meeting or some holiday event I'd politely ignore. But the contents made me freeze mid-step in my kitchen. Dear Mr. Reed, in the spirit of maintaining community standards and ensuring the safety and harmony of all properties within our sphere of influence, the Maple Hollow Homeowners Association kindly requests that you provide a set of duplicate keys to your mountain property. Given that you are now identified as owning multiple properties associated with our community's broader region, you are required to submit these keys no later than 30 days from the date of this letter. I reread it twice, blinking in. Disbelief. Associated? Broader region? What were they even talking about? My mountain cabin was nearly 200 miles away, tucked up in a completely different jurisdiction, an entirely separate world from Maple Hollow. I laughed out loud, shaking my head. Surely this was just some kind of weird clerical mistake, or an overreach by someone who didn't know how property boundaries worked. I tossed the letter into a drawer, figuring I'd deal with it later. Maybe send them a polite email explaining that they had no authority outside their own neighborhood. But they weren't done. 2 days later, another letter arrived, even more formal than the last, this time stamped second notice in bold red ink. The language was more aggressive. Failure to comply with the HOA's reasonable request to secure duplicate access to your secondary property may result in fines, sanctions, or additional action as deemed necessary under the Maple Hollow Community Standards Charter. As an owner of multiple residential properties tied to this community's extended influence, your participation is not optional. Now I was irritated. I sat down at my desk and pulled out my property documents. The suburban home? Clear, no HOA membership. The mountain cabin, entirely separate county, no shared agreements, no overlapping jurisdiction, no mention of Maple Hollow anywhere. I called up my friend Alan, who was not only a longtime buddy but also a real estate attorney. He laughed when I read him the letter. "Jackson," he said, "they have no leg to stand on. This is bluffing, plain and simple. Keep every letter they send, don't respond, and if they escalate, we'll be ready." Over the next week, the letters kept coming. They grew more ridiculous each time. Demands for inspection access, threats of legal consequences, even a mention of unified community harmony that sounded more like a cult slogan than anything enforceable by law. One letter claimed that new regional cooperation guidelines meant that all properties owned by residents within Maple Hollow's mailing zone automatically fell under their oversight. Another insisted that the HOA security committee had a right to ensure safety compliance on all secondary properties, especially those deemed vacation homes. At first, I found it hilarious. I even showed the letters to my friends over drinks, and we all laughed at the sheer absurdity. But as the tone hardened, I started to feel the edge of something darker creeping in. This wasn't just a nosy neighborhood association testing its limits. They were actively trying to insert themselves into my private life, into a property they had absolutely no right to touch. I decided to hold firm. I wouldn't reply. I wouldn't acknowledge them. But I had the uneasy feeling that ignoring them wasn't going to make them go away. In fact, something in the wording of the latest letter, the phrasing about further necessary steps, made me think they were just getting warmed up. The weekend arrived with the crisp, clean scent of mountain air, and I was ready to leave the HOA madness far behind. I packed up my truck, loaded the coolers, firewood, and an armful of groceries, and drove the winding highway up to my cabin. A couple of close friends and my sister's family were joining me for a long weekend, a chance to unplug, grill some steaks, hike a bit, maybe even break out the telescope and do some stargazing. The cabin was everything I loved, quiet, secluded, surrounded by towering pines and the sound of a distant creek. No emails, no HOA, no nonsense. By Saturday afternoon, we were in full relaxation mode. Kids were running around the yard with marshmallow sticky fingers. The grill was fired up, and music drifted lazily from a speaker on the porch. I was standing at the railing, beer in hand, watching the sunset smear orange across the sky when I heard it. The unmistakable crunch of tires on gravel. I turned, frowning. Visitors were rare up here, especially unannounced ones. A sleek black SUV rolled up the drive, polished to a shine, a logo on the side that made me squint. Maple Hollow Homeowners Association. My stomach dropped. Out stepped Sharon Myers, the president of the HOA back in the suburbs. She was dressed impeccably in a tailored blazer and glossy heels that looked completely out of place on a dusty mountain driveway. Behind her followed two other board members, faces I vaguely recognized from the occasional HOA flyer back home. They were carrying clipboards and folders like they were preparing for a formal audit. Sharon gave me a tight, thin-lipped smile as she approached the porch. "Mr. Reed," she called up, "we need to conduct a formal inspection of this property. Please unlock the door and grant us access." I set my beer down carefully, feeling the sudden shift in the air. "Excuse me?" I asked, stepping down a few steps to meet her halfway. She gave a gracious little nod. As you know, under the updated Maple Hollow regional guidelines, properties owned by members of our community, even outside the immediate neighborhood, fall under our oversight. We have reason to believe this mountain cabin qualifies. We're here to make sure it meets compliance standards." I stared at her, momentarily speechless. Behind me, my friends were gathering on the porch, murmuring in confusion. Sharon continued smoothly, "Of course, it's best if we do this voluntarily. If you refuse, we may need to escalate things formally." My temper flared. "You have no authority here," I said calmly but firmly. "This is private property, in a different county, in a different jurisdiction. You have no legal right to step 1 foot inside that cabin." Sharon's smile faltered just slightly, but she rallied quickly. "Jackson, let's not make this difficult. You don't want to seem uncooperative. We can call the police if necessary, but surely you understand the importance of working with the community." I folded my arms. "Call them." For a moment, there was a tense silence. Sharon's 2 sidekicks shifted uneasily, looking from me to her, clearly not expecting this to go so stiffly. Sharon's lips thinned into a sharp line. "Very well," she said crisply. "You leave us no choice." She pulled out her phone, dialed, and began explaining to someone on the other end that I was refusing lawful inspection and obstructing community access. I almost laughed out loud, but I held it in. Instead, I turned to my friends and family and calmly told them to keep enjoying the evening. I walked over to the porch, grabbed my phone, and called Alan, my lawyer. "You're not going to believe this," I told him with a smirk. The night air cooled as we waited, the sky darkening to deep purple, but the tension was just heating up. I could feel it, coiling tightly in the pit of my stomach. Sharon thought she could win this with intimidation, with a show of force. She had no idea she was about to run face first into a wall of legal brick. It didn't take long. Maybe 45 minutes after Sharon's smug phone call, 2 sheriff's deputies pulled up the long gravel drive in a dusty patrol truck, their headlights sweeping over the trees and casting long shadows across the cabin. I watched from the porch, arms crossed, feeling the low thrum of adrenaline in my chest. Sharon straightened her blazer and marched confidently to meet them, the 2 HOA board members trailing like obedient ducklings behind her. The lead deputy, a broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and the easy gait of someone used to small-town disputes, stepped out first. His partner, younger and slimmer, followed, adjusting his belt as he eyed the scene warily. Sharon launched into a rapid-fire explanation before they even fully approached, her voice tight with forced politeness. "Officers, thank you for coming so quickly," she began, waving her hands as if she were hosting a press conference. "I'm Sharon Myers, president of the Maple Hollow Homeowners Association. This gentleman here, Mr. Jackson Reed, is refusing to allow us to perform a lawful community inspection of this property, which, under newly aligned regional agreements, falls within our oversight. He is being deliberately obstructive, and we require your assistance in compelling cooperation." The older deputy raised one eyebrow and slowly turned his gaze toward me. "Sir," he drawled, "mind telling me your side?" I stepped down off the porch, keeping my voice even. "Deputies, thanks for coming out. My name's Jackson Reed. This is my private property, my personal residence in this county. It's not part of any HOA, local or otherwise. These people here," I gestured calmly toward Sharon's group, "are from a suburban HOA 2 counties over. They showed up uninvited and demanded entry, claiming they have some sort of oversight authority, which they absolutely do not. I've asked them repeatedly to leave, and they've refused. I'm concerned about trespassing." The younger deputy's brow furrowed, and he pulled out a small notebook. "You got documentation for that, sir?" "Absolutely." I reached into my folder, one I'd already prepared because Alan had told me over the phone to get everything ready, and handed over copies of the deed, property lines, county zoning, and most. Importantly, a formal legal letter Alan had emailed me stating the lack of any HOA jurisdiction over this land. The deputies huddled together, scanning the documents carefully under the beam of a flashlight. Sharon crossed her arms and shifted impatiently, whispering something sharply to her board members. After a few minutes, the older deputy straightened, cleared his throat, and turned back to us. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Sharon firmly, "this property is not under your authority. You have no legal grounds to demand entry here, no standing to inspect anything, and no right to involve your association in this matter." Sharon's mouth opened slightly, her face twisting from confident to confused to angry in seconds. "Officer, perhaps you're not familiar with the updated HOA Regional Cooperation Guidelines. This man is obstructing community standards, and I have every right." "Ma'am," the deputy interrupted, his voice cooling, "if you don't leave this property now, you may be facing charges of trespassing." And, he added with a pointed look, filing a false report by calling us under false pretenses can carry a penalty as well. I'd advise you to pack it up and head home before you make things worse. Behind me, I heard muffled laughter. One of my friends, unable to hold it in. Sharon's face turned an impressive shade of red, and her fists clenched at her sides. For a moment, I thought she might actually argue back, but after a long, taut silence, she hissed between her teeth, "This isn't over." She spun on her heel, barked at her companions to follow, and stormed back toward the SUV. I stood there, heart hammering, as the deputies gave me a small nod. "You handled that well, sir," the older one said quietly. "Let us know if they come back. You're well within your rights to press charges next time." "Thank you, officers," I said, genuinely meaning it. As they pulled away, the sound of tires crunching down the drive, I turned to my friends, who were grinning like idiots. One raised a beer in mock salute. "Well," I murmured, a smile tugging at my mouth, "that was one hell of a show." But even as the tension eased and we headed back to our evening, I knew this wasn't the end. Sharon had tasted defeat tonight, but her type didn't walk away quietly. I could already feel the next battle stirring just over the horizon, and this time, I'd be ready. The next morning, I was on the phone with Alan before I'd even finished my coffee. I told him everything. The surprise visit, the police intervention, Sharon's threats, the whole surreal scene under the mountain stars. Alan, usually calm and measured, let out a low whistle. "Jackson, this just crossed a serious line. They've gone from annoying letters to physical trespassing and false police reports. We need to hit back. Hard." He instructed me to gather every shred of evidence. I spent the next few hours meticulously organizing everything. I printed out the HOA's letters dating each envelope. I saved the voicemails Sharon had left on my phone, increasingly aggressive demands that I cooperate for the good of the community. I transferred the security footage from my porch camera, which had captured Sharon and her entourage marching up to my door, clipboards in hand, and then standing with their arms crossed while the deputies firmly told them to leave. I didn't stop there. I called the sheriff's office and requested a copy of the incident report, which they were happy to provide, given that Sharon had technically wasted their time with a false call. I even contacted my neighbors back in the suburbs, curious if anyone else had been targeted. To my surprise, several of them admitted, quietly, almost nervously, that they'd also received strange letters from the HOA, suggesting that their vacation properties or inherited land might now fall under the extended community umbrella. That was Alan's tipping point. "They're not just harassing you, Jackson," he said, voice sharp with purpose. "They're running a scheme. This is attempted overreach on a scale they can't legally justify, and if we move now, we can stop them before they hurt anyone else." Alan began drafting a formal cease and desist letter, naming not just Sharon Myers personally, but also the HOA as an entity. His language was surgical, outlining their repeated acts of harassment, their baseless demands, the illegal attempt to claim authority over property completely outside their jurisdiction, and the dangerous escalation to involving law enforcement. Under false pretenses, he made it crystal clear, if they so much as contacted me again, we would sue, not just for harassment, but for damages. But Alan wasn't stopping at threats. He advised we prepare a preemptive civil suit. "You've got everything," he told me, ticking off the list. Documented threats, false claims of authority, written demands for access, video evidence of trespass, a police report confirming their lack of jurisdiction, and, most importantly, a pattern of behavior. If we can show they've been trying this with other residents, we're not just defending you, we're exposing them. The more we dug, the uglier it got. A few brave neighbors admitted that Sharon had been quietly pressuring them for months, floating the idea of regional cooperation fees and shared resource contributions for properties they owned outside the HOA's official neighborhood boundaries. It was subtle, just vague enough to make people nervous without setting off alarms, until Sharon made the mistake of pushing too far with me. Alan's legal team got to work assembling affidavits and testimonies, and I added my name to the growing list of plaintiffs. We weren't just aiming to stop the harassment, we were preparing to hold Sharon and the entire HOA board accountable. And for the first time since this bizarre nightmare began, I felt the shift in momentum. They'd come onto my land, tried to muscle their way in, and believed they could walk away unscathed, but they'd underestimated something critical. I wasn't just some passive tech guy with a weekend cabin. I was a man who knew how to gather data, build a case, and fight back with precision, and they were about to learn just how costly their arrogance would become. By the time the court date arrived, the entire Maple Hollow HOA saga had exploded beyond anything I'd anticipated. Local reporters had caught wind of the lawsuit, a suburban HOA president trying to seize authority over a private mountain cabin. It was the kind of story that practically wrote its own headlines. Alan and I kept things tight and professional, but I won't lie. I took a small amount of satisfaction watching Sharon's smug confidence start to crack under the pressure. On the first day of the hearing, I walked into the courthouse dressed simply. Dark slacks, button-down shirt, no need for flashy suits. Across the room sat Sharon, flanked by two high-priced attorneys, their briefcases polished and expensive-looking. She wore a sleek white blazer, her hair meticulously styled, but her tight smile couldn't quite hide the tension in her jaw. Behind her, several board members sat uneasily, eyes darting as if they were wondering how they'd let things spiral this far. Alan opened strong. He laid out the timeline with clinical precision. The letters, the threats, the false claims of jurisdiction, the blatant trespassing, the false police report. He handed the judge neatly organized packets of evidence, complete with photos, video stills, police statements, and testimonies from other neighbors who had received similar predatory communications. Your Honor, Alan concluded, this is not a simple misunderstanding between neighbors. This is a deliberate, coordinated effort by a homeowners association to illegally expand its control over private property well beyond its legal bounds. My client, Mr. Reed, has been harassed, threatened, and targeted without cause, and we are here to ensure it ends. Sharon's lawyers tried to push back, of course. They argued that the HOA had a responsibility to maintain regional harmony, that the letters were merely suggestions, and that the visit to my cabin was intended as a friendly outreach. Unfortunately misunderstood. But as Alan coolly pointed out, friendly outreach doesn't come with demands for keys, written threats, or sheriff deputies' warning of trespass. What sealed the case, though, was the pattern of behavior. One by one, residents from Maple Hollow took the stand. Neighbors who had been too nervous to speak up before, but now found their courage. They described how Sharon had pressured them, sending letters about properties she had no legal authority over, hinting at vague fees and inspections, using the HOA's name like a weapon. The courtroom buzzed as each testimony stacked onto the next, painting a damning picture of power run amok. I watched Sharon closely as the weight of it all settled on her shoulders. The smugness was gone now. She sat rigid, her fingers clenched tightly in her lap, lips pressed into a thin, pale line. When the judge delivered the final ruling, her face flickered with something between disbelief and panic. The verdict was clear. The HOA's actions were illegal. They were ordered to pay $250,000 in damages to me, covering legal fees, emotional distress, and the cost of added security at my cabin. Beyond that, a separate investigation was opened into the HOA's board conduct, and a court-appointed external auditor was assigned to oversee the HOA's operations moving forward. Sharon, once the untouchable queen bee of Maple Hollow, was formally stripped of her position as president, effective immediately. As the court adjourned, reporters flooded the hallway. Alan shielded me from most of the questions, guiding me quickly through the crowd, but I couldn't help glancing back one last time. Sharon stood frozen near the courtroom doors, her lawyers murmuring urgently to her, her carefully polished image crumbling by the second. Our eyes met briefly. There was no more arrogance in hers, only stunned silence. I stepped outside, took a deep breath of cool mountain air, and let the weight roll off my shoulders. For the first time in weeks, I felt truly free. The fight was over, and we had won. A few weeks after the court ruling, I found myself driving back up the familiar winding road toward my mountain cabin, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't known in months. The sun hung low over the treetops, casting long golden beams across the landscape, and as I pulled into the gravel driveway, I felt something deep inside me finally loosen. The cabin stood proud and quiet, just as I'd left it. A sanctuary untouched by the chaos Sharon and her HOA had tried to drag me into. The first thing I did, even before unpacking the truck, was hammer a brand new sign into the ground by the front gate. It was custom-made, laser-etched into a beautiful slab of dark wood. Private property. No trespassing. Not part of any HOA. No keys, no inspections, no exceptions. I stepped back to admire it, smiling to myself. It wasn't just about keeping people out. It was a declaration, a reminder to myself that this was my space, earned, protected, and now reinforced by the law. That evening, I settled onto the wraparound porch with a steaming mug of coffee, listening to the wind whisper through the pines. My friends were arriving tomorrow for a small celebration, but tonight it was just me and the stars. I leaned back in the old wooden rocker, feeling the cool mountain breeze on my face, and let my mind wander back over everything that had happened. The suburban neighbors had changed too. After the lawsuit, I became something of a quiet legend back in Maple Hollow, the guy who stood up to the HOA and won. People who'd once avoided eye contact were now giving me small, respectful nods as they walked their dogs past my driveway. A few had even knocked on my door, thanking me for exposing Sharon's schemes and breaking the stranglehold she'd kept on the neighborhood for years. It wasn't that I'd wanted to be a hero. Honestly, I would have preferred to be left alone. But I realized that sometimes standing up for yourself sends ripples further than you ever expect. Alan, ever the practical lawyer, had joked that I should write a book about the whole mess. Jackson Reed versus HOA tyranny, he'd called it, laughing over drinks the night we signed the settlement papers. But honestly, I was content just knowing it was over. I didn't need headlines or glory. I just wanted to sit on this porch, sip my coffee, and know that no one, no matter how entitled or power-hungry, was going to storm up my driveway with a clipboard and a list of demands ever again. As the stars began to prick through the darkening sky, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. Gratitude for my friends, who'd stood by me and laughed through the absurdity. For Alan, whose sharp mind and steady hand had dismantled the HOA's entire case, and even for the cabin itself, this place that had reminded me why it was worth fighting. So hard to protect what's yours. I leaned back, closing my eyes, letting the cool night wrap around me like a blanket. Somewhere below, the creek murmured quietly, and a breeze stirred the pine branches overhead. And as I sat there, completely at peace, I smiled to myself and thought, let them come. Let any HOA in the country hear the name Jackson Reed, and know that here in these mountains there are no keys to demand, no inspections to conduct, and no victories to claim. This was my home, and no one was ever taking it from me.